This lecture will be on fiscal realignment and local government financing. I'm going to talk about Prop 13 and its effect on local government financing. This realignment, it's called fiscal realignment, in the 30 years since Prop 13 has passed, has significantly shifted the source and allocation of local government revenues. This is probably the number one thing you need to understand about California and its financing and its effect on local government. First of all, we'll talk about Prop 13. Prior to Prop 13, property taxes were collected locally and they were spent locally, especially with schools. Most of the school funding prior to Prop 13 came from property tax, local property tax. When Prop 13 passed, the rules changed. Property taxes continued to be assessed and collected at the local level, but the state was now in charge of distributing the property tax receipts among local governments within each county. In other words, the local government was no longer in charge of how the money was distributed. The second point is, and this of course was beneficial to most property tax owners, myself included, limited the property tax rate to 1% of full market value. Prior to Prop 13, property taxes were going up so fast, people were losing their homes, especially elderly, because their property was being assessed at a high rate and they were being taxed at that rate. Following Prop 13, the assessed value of property was capped at the 1975-76 base year, plus there was an allowance for inflation, or 2% per year, and property that declined in value could be reassessed at the lower market value. Fourth point is property is reassessed to the current full value upon change in ownership. So what this means is, let's say I owned a house in 1976 and that property tax rate became fixed at that point. It could go up a little bit, inflation or 2% per year, but it was not reassessed and it did go up. So a conservative value in 1976 for a home, let's say, was $80,000. Today, if I lived in that same home, I would be paying property tax at a little over $80,000, just a little bit. It might have gone up a little bit every year. And it could be that the homes next to me are now valued at $250,000 and they're paying property tax at 3 times what I'm paying. That's sort of what has happened since Prop 13. If you stay in your home, that's fine, and your property tax will go up that minimal amount. However, once you sell that house and somebody else buys it, it is reassessed at the new value. So let's say I live in this home, now I decide I want to sell it, and I sell it for $250,000. The new owner's property tax is going to be a lot higher than what mine was. So that's what property looks like from the citizen's standpoint. Me as a property owner, or me as somebody who wants to buy or sell a house. The fifth point is that it requires a 2/3 voter approval to raise any special taxes, which means since Prop 13 has passed, it has not changed, because getting that 2/3 vote has been very difficult. The final point I want to make is it transferred the authority for allocating property tax revenues from local government to the state. I have already mentioned this. So what happened, instead of Riverside deciding how to spend Riverside's property taxes, now the property taxes that are collected in Riverside all go to Sacramento. And the decision for how to spend that money is now in Sacramento. So what has happened since Prop 13 passed? Well, it's had some good things that came of it, and it has some things that are problematic for California today. For the elderly and low-income homeowners, this was a big victory. The tax burden was lowered, so we didn't have elderly and low-income people losing their homes because it had gone up in value. We have that disparate treatment of similarly situated properties. That's what I was telling you. You can have the one home that's worth, that's paying property taxes based on an $80,000 assessment, and you can have the house right next door to it that's paying property taxes on a $250,000 assessment. And so it's very unequal that way. Right after Prop 13 passed, property tax revenues decreased sharply. A 60% decrease. Now imagine this. The revenue for the state went down by 60% following the passage of Prop 13. That's a lot of money to lose. In particular, within 3 years, the school district's share of property tax receipts fell from an average of over 50% to about 30%. In other words, this property tax that was going in was no longer coming back to the school districts because the state needed the money. There became a greater reliance of the school districts on state general fund for county and school funding. So now the counties and the school districts are looking to Sacramento for funds. Used to be we created our own funds. Now we have to look to Sacramento to send those funds to us. Now the state took over primary responsibility for funding K through 12 education. In other words, the local school boards, we know, are not giving out the funds anymore, and Sacramento is responsible for funding K through 12. So you see how there was a total shift in control over your local school districts as a result of Prop 13. The money in the state's general fund was used to offset the shortfall in education budgets. So time and again, the state general fund had to make up the difference so that we could give the schools the money that they needed. In 1988, we passed Prop 98. And this is another initiative. And Prop 98 says 40% of the state's budget must be allocated to funding for K through 14. That's, of course, the community college system. Now that's 40% of the state's general fund budget. So whether it doesn't matter if it's a good year or a bad year, at least 40% of the state's general fund must be allocated to K through 14. In 1992, a new law was passed. It goes by the name of ERAF, which is the Educational Revenue Augmentation Funds. And what this did was it shifted partial responsibility for funding education back to local government. The state instructed county auditors to shift the allocation of local property tax revenues from local government to educational revenue augmentation funds. What this means is the state has told the counties to take some of the money that would be going to local government services. That's your trash pickup and all those other services that local governments do. To shift some of those that they have and put it into an augmentation fund to fund education. Since this started, the ERAF shifts have deprived local governments of over $51 billion. So you can see the effect. I mean, we've already seen the effect on education, on the detrimental effect of it on education. Now, because we're shifting funds with Prop 98 and the ERAF law, now we are shifting funds trying to save education, but it has to come from somewhere, and of course it's coming from local government. Now the state has provided some funding to local government that mitigates ERAF. However, if you talk to most local government officials, they will tell you that the funds that have come back to them have not made up this difference. So now we're going to talk about the consequences of fiscal realignment. And I'm going to talk about three major consequences. The first is called fiscalization of land use. The second is intergovernmental dependence. And the third is innovative financing. What we mean by this fiscal realignment is when for a long time your money came from one source, and now you have a totally different source of income. You have a whole different system set up. Everything has changed. So the first one was fiscalization of land use. This refers to the increasingly important objective of encouraging development that provides a revenue stream to local government. How many times have you asked, how many housing developments can we have? Well, we can have a lot of housing developments, and the local governments encourage this because the first thing is they're trying to increase the property tax base, and this incurs additional infrastructure and service costs. So we have this land, let's get it developed. That will increase our property tax base, and then it will also increase some of the fees and services that we can add on to this development. It makes the land more valuable. And however, there's a cost to these housing developments because you need more roads, you need parks, you need all sorts of things, you need to supply electricity, etc. So it's we need the development and we benefit from the development, but then there's also a cost involved with it. The other thing is this fiscalization of land use sometimes takes the form of encouraging retail commercial development. The big box stores, the Costco's, the Walmarts, the shopping centers, the outlets, the big shopping centers like Ontario Mills Mall and things like that, and auto centers where all the car dealers are together. This helps local governments because they get that sales tax that comes in, a portion of the sales tax. So the more we spend within the jurisdictional boundaries of a particular city, the better it is for the city. And what has happened is the cities have given away a lot of incentives to people like Walmart and Costco, etc., to please set up business here so we can have some sales tax, and this will help our revenue stream. The second thing that it has created has been intergovernmental dependence. The realignment has made counties and school districts dependent on the state government for funding. I've already talked to you about that. It has moved the decision making from the local communities to Sacramento. And other than competing with other cities for the same retail developments, cities have few options to generate their own income. And so this has, it's made, Riverside and Corona into competitors because we're all trying to increase our retail sales. The third and final result of the fiscal realignment that I wanted to talk about is innovative financing. I've put two topics under this. Really only going to talk about the second one. The first one is certificates of participation. Certificates of participation are, think of those as investment. Those are investment vehicles like stocks and bonds, etc. And cities create certificates of participation as an investment device to create some money. The one that you're more likely to have heard about, and it's certainly in the news lately, is redevelopment. Redevelopment is also known as tax increment financing. And this is a way of making your property worth more. So if it's worth more, that's good for you because you can get more money out of it. So first, a city or county forms a redevelopment agency. Then they declare an area blighted. So let's say they have created this, we know we have a redevelopment agency. So we have a particular area in Riverside that we think if we could improve that area, it would bring in more money. It's usually a commercial development. So if this area can be improved, then the property value will increase, and so will the property tax receipts. And if it's a commercial area, of course, so will the sales receipts. So the redevelopment agency borrows money for the improvements. They then make the improvements, and then the idea is that once those improvements have been made, the increased tax receipts, the tax increment to pay the debt, will provide additional income to the city or county.